How's it going, everybody? In this video, I'm going to be talking about The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris and do a kind of a book review summary. So, The Moral Landscape is best for those who are interested in philosophy, specifically how topics like science, well-being, and morality can interact and how they are pulled together. It's also going to be good for people who are interested in psychology, values, well-being, stuff like that. It all plays into this book. The difficulty to digest. So it's fairly easy to digest, but there are some more difficult pieces. So a lot of the concepts are laid out in ways that are easy to understand, but there are certain bits and pieces that are a lot heavier and will take a little bit to digest if you don't have the background. So those who are already kind of familiar with psychology and some philosophy are going to have a head start in understanding the book, but pretty much anyone should be able to get through it with a little bit of extra maybe digging or some contemplation, reflection, if there are ideas that are completely foreign to you. On to the key insights. So The Moral Landscape is Harris's attempt to bring together morality and science using tools from philosophy and psychology to build out that argument. That's the main thesis of the book. It goes into some other topics that can feel a little bit tangential, but at the core, it's Harris trying to say that with science, we can basically prove out a set of morality. So at the core, the idea is that everything we do in a moral sense is related to well-being or the well-being of conscious creatures of some kind. And if that's the baseline, then we can use science to determine peaks and valleys on kind of the spectrum of things that produce well-being or take away from well-being. So let's talk a little bit about well-being as the basis for morality. The idea here is basically that all moral acts are meant to increase the well-being of conscious creatures in some way. So for example, religion, right? A lot of the religions, you take or have sacrifices now so that you don't end up in some hell-like place for eternity, right? The overall net gain is in well-being and consciousness, right? What you end up with is a better state of mind, a better existence in the future. So if what we're working for in morality is sort of this idea of well-being for sentient beings, then the next major theme is that science can help determine what those maximums are. Now, the baseline itself, you can argue with a little bit, right? You can say that maybe well-being isn't the basis for morality. Maybe we're not always looking to do things that are going to increase the well-being of conscious creatures. There are a lot of arguments in the book that kind of bolster that claim, but there are some other people who have some kind of disagreements with that or other angles that we could potentially look at. Now, assuming that you take that at face value and that you think that well-being is the thing that we're striving towards, the well-being of conscious creatures, then Harris argues that we can use science to kind of determine the maximums, right? And what he's saying is we may not know exactly everything at the moment, and there may not be one right answer, but over time, with science, with experimentation, as we learn more about brain states and what makes people feel good or what constitute well-being, then we will be able to start to determine, okay, these things are not good for people, these things are, we'll move more towards this direction, towards more of these peaks and away from some of the valleys of the potential option set. Now, you might be wondering, what is the specifics of well-being? Like, what does that mean in essence? And Harris doesn't take a crack at any of the specifics there. He relates it to some different examples, but one of them is physical health, where we know what it means to be physical healthy in a sense, but at the same time, there's not a strict definition, right? You generally get the idea of what it means to be physically healthy, even if there is not a clear set of criteria. So the same kind of thing applies in his kind of philosophy here, in that we kind of know what well-being is, even if we don't have the exact pieces to describe it. But as the science kind of grows and expands, we'll get more and more data points to fill in what counts as well-being and what doesn't. Now, there's another point I want to bring up here, and Harris mentions the difference between the experiencing and remembering self. That's something from Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's basically the idea that, we can take actions for our present self, or we can take actions for our remembering self. Harris takes the angle of saying, it's actually really just kind of the same thing, where the remembering self is a version of the present self, right? It's you in the present thinking about something in the past. So Thinking Fast and Slow has kind of some arguments about which one you should weigh out, but Harris basically says that first, we don't spend that much time recalling experience. We spend a lot more time living an experience, and even when we are recalling, we're still experiencing, right? So he says to kind of weight things towards the experiencing self, which, again, there are some other tangents that could open up there, but they're not really discussed in the book, so I won't go over them here. Now, another big piece of this book is how beliefs influence morality, and Harris spends a bunch of time talking about how basically beliefs are formed, how they show up in the brain, how basically like moral beliefs and truth beliefs show up in the brain the same way. So basically the idea there is that they're kind of the same thing, that if we find the truth of something, we'll believe it as a moral imperative. Now, that doesn't mean that what we believe is truth is actually truth out in the world, but basically the psychological functioning is much the same. And on that note, in the moral landscape, it's argued basically that these ideas of truth that we have do not necessarily produce well-being, so it doesn't make them a good necessarily. So, for example, he gives this clan that is really malevolent and just does all sorts of awful things because they think those actions are moral in some way. They think they're truth. They think they're what you are supposed to do or have to do. But those beliefs don't produce well-being, so in his mind, those are not moral. And there are a bunch of different societal constructs or psychological baselines that can kind of distort what we think we should do to produce well-being, but just because we think it's true doesn't necessarily mean that's what's going to happen. And then, of course, as Sam Harris does, he attacks religion as kind of the basis for morality. He looks at some ways that the brain is kind of structured to want to have these sorts of beliefs, but the specifics can be filled with anything. And then, of course, he goes into how the science doesn't really map well to the religious aspects. There's a decent sized chunk that just kind of talks about how some people have tried to say, like, oh, these two things cannot be put together, right? They're in their own separate realms. Or people who say, oh, these things can coexist. And he kind of dispels or makes arguments against both of those points and to say that they can't really exist together. They do overlap the same realms, but they're not compatible. Another big piece is kind of genetics and morality. So a lot of people have this kind of intuition that things that are natural are good. But again, going back to the baseline argument that well-being is what we're trying to optimize for, a lot of the things that we find natural or that are natural are not necessarily good at promoting well-being. So Harris argues that they're not morally good choices. So, for example, attacking someone, right? Feeling jealousy when someone looks at your partner in a certain way or tries to hit on them, and executing some sort of physical violence against them is something that is natural, right? Biologically, we want to defend against our mates, against other potential mates taking them. But that's not going to optimize well-being. So something that's very natural, right, in our psychology and our biology isn't something that's necessarily moral because it doesn't produce well-being. Another really clear example is cancer, right? Cancer is a completely natural process. It's something that naturally happens, but it definitely doesn't produce well-being, right? It produces the opposite. So the argument there is that basically things that are natural it doesn't mean they're good or that they are moral or right. So overall, I think the moral landscape is an interesting but a little bit winding discussion of how science can optimize well-being and why that could or should be considered morality. There's definitely enough tangents and enough topics that get covered that it's not completely straightforward, but there's definitely also enough substance to pull out some interesting and unique ideas that are worth considering. So overall, I'm going to recommend it, but only if it fits in that sweet spot of what you're looking for, where this idea kind of seems interesting to you and you want to get a little bit more of an expansion on some of the details. Now, on to other considerations. So the main consideration here is that Sam Harris attacks religion constantly. That's something you're going to find throughout all of his works. So if that's something that you're uncomfortable with, this is not going to be a good fit for you. Another piece kind of going along with that is ideas that he doesn't like, he tends to attack very strongly or just completely dismiss out of hand. So sometimes it can be frustrating because there's a particular argument that you want to see flushed out or a position that maybe you hold or you think has some weight, and he will just out of hand completely dismiss it as ridiculous or stupid or something else. That can be really off-putting depending on your position and the exact ideas being discussed. So that kind of aggressive ideological posturing can be a turnoff. So it's something to be aware of and ready for if you choose to read this. Now onto the applicable content. 1. How can you use experimentation to optimize your own well-being? 2. How do your beliefs influence your happiness? 3. Are any of your natural impulses working against your overall well-being? How might you moderate them? So again, all in all, I think this is a decent book if you kind of are interested in the idea and want to learn more. Otherwise, there's probably some better resources that'll get you a more pointed or more practical set of ideas to improve your life, right? This is kind of more on like a philosophical scale. But if that's of interest, this is worth looking at just to read through some of the ideas. Again, winding a little bit, but there is some interesting things in there. That's all I've got for this video. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, topics you want me to cover, throw them down in the box below. I will get to them as soon as I can, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe, as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com. And if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well. And that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.